Well, welcome to our panel today. I'm Mark Ellis. I'm a technology manager in the Bioenergy Technologies Office of DOE. I'll be moderating a panel composed of 3 experts in the area of mitigating risk and barriers. Certainly mitigating risk through techno-economic and risk assessments is a key priority of the Bioeconomy Initiative, and this panel will explore how understanding and quantifying technology uncertainties and financial risks is pivotal to the success of the bioeconomy. So first, let me introduce our panel. My first panelist is Jordan Solomon from EcoStrat. He has held the position of President and CEO of EcoStrat for over 20 years, where he oversees the Biomass Advisory Board, the Biomass Supply Group, and development of the new U.S. national standards for biomass supply chain risk. His areas of expertise include project development, supply chain risk assessment, bioresource training, contracting and financing, and risk mitigation for biofeedstock supply and export. As head of the Biomass Supply Group, Jordan has overseen development and operation of biomass supply chains for over 5 million tons of feedstock over 2 decades of bioenergy, biofuel, and biochemical projects. And he currently sits on the Bioenergy Feedstock National User Facility Advisory Board at Idaho National Lab, and he holds a BA honors from Western University and a master's in environmental studies with a specialty in corporate environmental strategy from York. Our second panelist is Dr. Christopher Clark. Dr. Clark is a research scientist in the U.S. EPA Center for Public Health and Environmental Assessment in Washington, D.C. He works on a range of issues, developing research to support scientifically informed decision-making at the EPA and other federal and state agencies. This includes environmental sustainability of biofuels in the U.S., impacts from air pollution from atmospheric deposition on natural forest and non-forested ecosystems, and the effects from climate change on forest health and projects related to improving the way we use the nutrients nitrogen and phosphorus in agriculture. Chris has had many roles, including leading the 3rd triennial report to Congress on biofuels, which we'll hear about a bit later, and has also worked on the analysis and sustainability working groups under the Biomass Research and Development Board. Chris's work focuses on assessing land use change in the U.S., but covers issues related to changes in soil erosion, water quality, habitat for wildlife, and others. Chris holds a PhD in ecology and environmental biology from the University of Minnesota and 2 BS degrees from the University of California in physics and in environmental resource sciences. And our third panelist is Dr. Tim Volk, who comes to us from the Department of Sustainable Resources Management at the State University of New York, College of Environmental Science and Forestry. Dr. Volk has 30 years of experience working in the field of forestry, agroforestry, short rotation woody crops, bioenergy, and phytoremediation in the northeastern U.S. and West Africa. In his current position at SUNY, he is responsible for research projects focused on the development of shrub willow biomass cropping systems as a feedstock for bioproducts and bioenergy. He is also actively involved in R&D of harvesting systems for short rotation woody crops and sustainability assessments of bioenergy systems, including life cycle and techno-economic analysis of willow biomass crops and woody biomass from forests. So I just want to thank my panelists for joining today. We have a limited time set, so I'm just going to begin our panel discussion. I'll open with a few questions and then be able to reserve some time at the end to take some questions from our audience via the chat function. The first question, the Biomass R&D Board is celebrating its 20th anniversary this year. Since 2013, the board has worked to shape the Bioeconomy Initiative to address key scientific and technical challenges to enable the sustainable production and utilization of biomass for affordable domestic biofuels, bioproducts, and biopower. Over the years, the federal government and industry have increasingly focused on high-value bioproducts and co-products to enable biofuels. What impact has this emphasis made for the bioeconomy? Maybe I'll start with Tim.
Sure, thanks Mark, and thanks for the invitation to be here. So, I think that emphasis on the broad array of products that can come from biomass has been essential because, in essence what we have captured in plants is a whole lot of different compounds that can be made into different products. And, as is true in the petroleum industry, it's not a single stream flow, right? So it's not oil in and just gasoline out, it's multiple products. And so I think that's an essential component, and taking the same approach with biomass and developing the bioeconomy around that certainly has a real impact, right? There are often low volume, high value products that can be generated out of biomass that can have a significant impact on the bottom line of an entire system. And so putting those pieces together and trying to develop those systems so that those multiple products can be generated is an important part of the success of building out the bioeconomy.
Okay, thank you. And Jordan, if you have any comments on this. You may be muted, Jordan. Chris, did you have any thoughts that you can share?
Yeah, can you hear me okay, Mark?
Yes.
Yep. Yeah, thanks also for the invitation of participating in this panel. And yeah, I think I would just echo, what our earlier speaker was saying, that I think that, it's not just a single, product that can be produced from these raw materials. There's a whole array of products that potentially could be produced in a cost-effective manner. And it takes a lot of time and R&D and exploration in order to come up with the optimal configurations to use them. So it's not necessarily going to be obvious at the onset how this resource should be developed, and it takes time for both the R&D and the market to sort of realize that potential.
Okay, thank you, Chris. Jordan.
Hi, can you hear me now?
Yes,
right,
I can.
Thank you. Thank you. Yeah, I think bioproducts and focusing on high-value bioproducts and co-products to enable biofuels has, been vital to drive and diversify the bioeconomy. But I think it's important to, in order to support that kind of strategy, it's important to focus on supporting platforms and supporting strategies that help that address the risks and barriers to getting those kind of bioproducts and co-products in particular, and getting plants that produce those bioproducts and co-products to get built. And what that means is addressing financing risks, one of the other key factors. So I think the focus has borne a lot of fruit. I think there's more work to be done.
Okay, thank you. Just a follow-up question, and I think you already perhaps answered part of that already, Jordan, but beyond bioproducts, what are some other strategies to reduce financial risks? Timothy, you want to take a shot at that?
Sure, I'm happy to. I'll talk later in this session about a platform-based initiative that we've been driving with the fantastic support of VITO over the past 5 years, and together with Idaho National Labs. But I would in general say that it's vitally important to support, not just to pick winners, because when you pick winners, you pick losers, but to support more platform-based initiatives, in particular market-based initiatives that are accretive, that help whatever the technology is, whether it's biofuels, biochemicals, biomaterials, whatever is the output that help facilities that build those kind of bio-based products to get built. They need to be platforms that help address issues common to all, and that are really accretive, that are again technology agnostic, and help them than scale. So I would say if we're talking about what other strategies, we think it's vitally important that some of the strategies that we've been promoting for years and that we're hearing about today are leveraged with existing current government programs that also function to reduce financial risk for the bioeconomy. And I can give a particular program that we think is vital to be and right to be leveraged, and that's the new, the 3-year-old, 4-year-old federal opportunity zone program, which is the largest tax incentive program in the history of the United States. It's already raised over $89 billion. It's managed to channel almost $11 billion into some of the almost 9,000 federally designated opportunity zones, but almost all that $11 billion has gone to real estate development. Almost none of it has gone to support bio-based development. And so we think it's important to leverage a program like that by using, in particular, one of the platforms that I'll talk about later in this panel, the BSCR standards, to leverage that program to enable it to allocate billions of dollars that would not normally be allocated to biomass, feedstock, and bio-based projects to those projects.
Okay. All right. Thank you, Jordan. And Tim, did you have anything to share from your perspective?
Yeah, I'll just, it's great. We've got different perspectives on this, which is helpful. So I'm going to speak more from a feedstock supply production end of the system where I spend most of my time. And I think, you know, this was mentioned in the previous panel. I think Bill Goldner and a couple other people brought it up, but the idea of valuing ecosystem services. So I think, you know, landowners and growers that are going to get into producing crops to feed into the bioeconomy are going to add other values, right? So there's carbon storage value. We've recently published a paper showing that we can not only grow biomass in a willow system, but at the same time we can sequester carbon below ground and in the soils. And if that gets valued, you know, that may be $5 to $15 a ton. That could be added value for landowners, which makes a real difference in terms of the risk that they're bearing and the uncertainty they have in terms of being able to make their operation functional. You know, likewise, water quality is another thing. You know, in many areas of the country, we're dealing with these harmful algae blooms, and there's lots of work going on to address them. And if we were wise about placing energy crops across the landscape, we could be helping to address that issue. And, you know, there's estimates out there, again, another $5 to $15 a ton of value could be added to perennial biomass crops. And so when you start putting those things together, and if we valued ecosystem services, that could be an important piece in making landowners and growers engage in this process and to help reduce some of the risk and market uncertainty that they're facing as well. So I think that end of the production system is another one to think about how we can mitigate risk by valuing ecosystem services.
Okay. All right. Thank you. Then we'll move on to a new line of question. There's a number of different types of financing opportunities across the federal government. In your experience, how has government financial assistance for research, development, and or infrastructure made a difference for you or your local communities? And how has it encouraged private sector financing as well? Who would like to go first? Jordan?
Yeah, sure. I'm happy to go first. We have been through Idaho National Labs, and together with Idaho National Labs, the recipient of a very forward-thinking and generous financing by BITO over the past, we're moving into our 5th year, I believe, right now, to develop a project that really addresses a key barrier to investing or financing bio-based projects, and that is the project to develop biomass standards to biomass supply chain risk. Now, this is an absolutely vital project because one of the key issues with feedstock risk and financing bio-based projects is that balance sheet financing, traditional balance sheet financing, doesn't work. And it doesn't work because typically bio-based suppliers, farmers or forestry producers or growers don't have balance sheets to finance. So they're small to medium sized typically, and that really complicates biomass finance. It means three things. It means that bio-based finance is slow, it means it's expensive, and it means it's difficult. All the problems that we're so familiar with. And so inability to quantify feedstock risk in a way that the capital markets understand has been a real ball and chain on development of projects. And it sometimes causes up to 250 basis points increase in debt costs. And this project solves that. Traditionally, there has been multiple different approaches, non-standardized approaches to understanding feedstock risk. The financing that's been supplied again by BITO that we've carried out with Idaho National Labs over the 5 years has enabled the production of a standardized approach to doing that. And a standardized approach is absolutely vital because when you have a standardized approach, you have for bio what the credit markets have always had to deploy almost $10 trillion of financing. So when S&P and Moody's and Fitch give a credit rating, they follow a standardized protocol. That's exactly what we have traditionally not had with bio. Development of one has enabled a step change advance in terms of capital market finance. And we know that because we tested it. We developed these standards and the ratings. We tested them on a JP Morgan project versus traditional ways of financing, and the results were quite startling. The difference in perceived risk on the part of the capital markets decreased by over fivefold with the application of the standards. Before application of the standards, we found that over 33% of salient risks in large bio-based projects were actually being missed. And so development of the standards enables a comprehensive addressing of the full spectrum of feedstock risk that can be the difference between a project sinking or being profitable. And when you have that, capital markets can structure around that, and we have more successful projects. So yeah, the financing's been a big difference.
Okay, thank you, Jordan. Tim, from your perspective.
Yeah, so I think a good example is the USDA BCAP project. Again, that was mentioned in the previous panel, but there were a number of these, 10 or 11 of these zones set up around the country. There was one in northern New York to grow willow, and I think the impacts from that are significant. So really the BCAP program helped to de-risk the growing of energy crops for landowners, right? The funds were going to landowners to help with establishment and then payment in non-harvest years. That helped a bunch of landowners, 14 or so landowners in upstate New York, take the step forward and make the investment to start growing energy crops. So they made a significant amount of investment. Then at the end user end, there was a company in northern New York called Re-Energy, and they got involved in this process, and they actually went out and signed 11-year contracts. They were willing to put out 11-year contracts to buy all the biomass that these landowners would grow during that BCAP period of time. And so there's a company on the outside that wanted this biomass supply and was stepping in to make that investment as well. There's been a number of things that have come out of this that are also important in terms of changing the perception of people across the region about what willow is and how it's grown. There's nothing like being able to run a harvester through a willow crop and inviting the local community to come and watch it, to dispel myths about how the system works. And so those kind of benefits are intangible, but in many ways valuable if you then want to scale up and expand the system. Another investment that occurred out of this, Mark, that I just mentioned is New Holland Agriculture. So we had engaged with them around developing a harvesting system. When this expansion started, they really shifted their emphasis and went and started developing their own specially designed piece of equipment to fit on their forage harvesters, whereas previously they had really looked at making use of some other ones that were being developed in the market. And so New Holland Agriculture also made a significant investment, and now there's commercially available equipment that can be used in short rotation wood crops across the U.S. and actually Europe and other places in the world as well. So, that one investment there had a number of valuable spin-off benefits, I think, both in terms of other investments, but also in terms of changing perceptions and understanding of how these systems work on the landscape.
Okay. Well, thank you, Tim. All right. Move on.
Yeah, Mark, if I might jump in. Yeah, just not with a response to the financing, but I heard some interesting ideas that I wanted to explore a little more. Or maybe, Jordan, if you can elaborate a little bit more on, you've been discussing feedstock risk. Are you linking, it must not just be the feedstock itself, but the feedstock and where it's grown and how it's grown and what it's used for? Can you elaborate a little bit more on what the scope of that is in your capital risk estimates?
It's a good question, Chris. The risk standards cover the full spectrum of risks from the harvest of the biomass, whether it's agriculture or forestry biomass, or in the case of food waste, the production of the food waste, through to the delivery, through to the reactor throat. So these are the set of risks that can occur between that beginning and that end, the reactor throat. We consider, for the purposes of the standards, biomass supply chain risk. The standards consist of 126 different risk pathways or indicators that can function to comprise risk in those over that full supply chain. So they do not deal with technology risks. Can you make it? Mm-hmm. They do not deal with market risks. Can you sell it? So in terms of bio-based project finance, there are always three buckets of risk, as I'm sure you know. There are can you get it risks, feedstock, in this case feedstock supply chain risks. Can you make it risks, and can you sell it type of risks. These are really the three project risk buckets. The feedstock supply standards are not designed to address a third and the second bucket, but they are a huge step forward in the state of the science in helping capital markets understand capital risk. And that's very, very important, because when the capital markets understand feedstock risk, they can structure around it. The problem becomes when they're not able to understand it. And a bolt from the blue comes in, and that's when we see the projects start to fail. So building this is a step, a huge step forward in helping projects succeed.
Okay, great. Well, Chris, probably a question more geared for you, but the board's interagency working group support analysis as a foundation for stable long-term policies. How can EPA's triennial report to Congress help address risk and navigate barriers for the emerging biofuel industry?
Yeah, I mean, that's an interesting question, because the triennial report series, just if you're not familiar with it, is specified under the Energy Independence and Security Act of 2007. And so we're required every 3 years to assess the impacts to date and likely future effects of the RFS program. So this is really focused on the liquid transportation fuel component of the bioeconomy. And in doing so, we evaluate all of these different possible environmental and resource conservation endpoints, like losses of habitat, changes to air quality, changes to water quantity, acreages of grasslands, forests, and wetlands. So there's all these different environmental potential impacts that are evaluated. And so, there is certainly a role for the triennial report to evaluate where the data support it, a quantitative assessment looking forward of some of these new feedstocks that come to bear. This has not traditionally been the role of the report. The role of the report traditionally has been more looking to the past to see like what have been the impacts to date, rather than really a tool of a prospective analysis. But both of those scopes are actually included in the statutory language, and so it could be expanded to look at that. But I think that some of our partners, especially veto-funded work out of the National Renewable Energy Labs, Argonne, there's lots of really good analytical tools that are out there that already kind of assess both air quality impacts, non-GHG air quality impacts, as well as impacts across a range of environmental endpoints. So I think there's a lot of opportunity. It's just a question of how much of it really falls within the wheelhouse of the triennial report or not.
Okay. And a follow-up, just can you speak to the importance of making that report and that information in the report publicly available?
Yeah, I mean, I think that, this transparency in science is like a critical component to federal research enterprise. And so all of the data that supports these decisions, almost all of it comes from peer-reviewed material. And where possible, all the data sets that are used to come to these conclusions are made publicly available through the EPA's Science Hub. So not only the report, but like the information that goes into the report needs to be publicly available so that we have this transparency.
Okay, thank you. All right, new question. Sometimes investors and the public are concerned by perceived risk or technology challenges that were analyzed and overcome years ago. To overcome this problem, the Bioeconomy Initiative highlights industry and accomplishments. What is a perceived risk that you still get asked about? Maybe I'll start with Tim.
Sure. So there's a number of things that are still out there. I think there's misunderstandings of many biomass. I'm going to speak from the supply side of the things again, in terms of what they are and how they're grown. So I think a lot of people have not had exposure to those kind of systems, and so there's misperceptions about them being monocrops and what they do to biological diversity. In reality, a lot of these perennial energy crops that are being developed actually enhance biodiversity across the landscape by providing an entirely different type of structure in an agriculturally dominated landscape in many situations. And so they actually add value, don't detract around them. I think another one that's often misunderstood is issues around quality of the biomass, and that was mentioned earlier, how important it is to have consistent and reliable quality to go to end users so that that next step in the process can run the way it's designed. And, people often hear about some of these biomass crops. So willow that I work with has got a perception, you would not cut a willow tree down to make firewood. It's got a lower specific gravity, but in reality, it's got the same amount of energy per kilogram as any other hardwood out there. And the composition in terms of making other products out of it is the same as hardwood. So you can mix it with other hardwoods, for example. So just not an understanding of the components that are involved in these systems and things like quality, biodiversity. I think there's still a lot of misunderstanding around land use change issues and what is going on and associated with that as well is another issue that I think is still not well understood.
Yeah, thank you, Tim. I mean, certainly in the feedstock program at Beetle, certainly feedstock quality has really taken center stage. We worry about the cost and quantity, but quality is really, really important to keep an eye on in order to solve some of the feed handling problems that happen in some of the pioneer plants in the past. And so that's a major focus of the feedstock technologies program. Jordan, I know that the risk standards were basically set up to close the gap between actual risk and perceived risk, but I'm sure you can explain it a lot better than I can. So.
They certainly were, Mark, and yet we continue to be asked again and again about the quanta of feedstock risks for the projects that are getting financed. And so what risks are we still asked about? Despite the development of a comprehensive standard to quantify feedstock risk, despite the fact that that standard was compiled basis the feedback of a stakeholder group of over 150 leading bio-based finance, capital markets, operators of facilities, the equipment suppliers, the growers. Despite the fact that all that feedback went into the standards, we are still asked about feedstock risk. And that brings me to the point that if we want the standard to be used, if we want it to really function to drive change in the bioeconomy, we need to get uptake from the capital markets so that they use it. And in order to do that, we need to prove it. In order to prove it, we need to apply it to more case studies. So more case studies are absolutely important. The other thing that's important is that we drive those case studies out to the capital markets. In order to do that, we've taken some major steps in the past year. We've formed the largest group of capital markets in North America today. There are almost 70 of the key investors in the bioeconomy today involved in, it's called the BSCR Standards Risk Ratings Review Committee. It's almost a $65 billion group, and it's those groups, that group that needs to validate the case study application of the standards and the ratings so that they use it when they're looking to finance capital markets. That's clearly one way that we do that.
Okay, great. And Chris, any follow-up comments? Or?
Yeah. I mean, I think the one, pervasive uncertainty that is, I would not say completely resolved, but we're in the process of, trying to resolve it as much as we can, is what Tim alluded to earlier, which is, how much land use change is actually occurring on the landscape. Depending on which papers you read and which data sets you look at, the estimates vary wildly. And so it's difficult for the public and investors and regulators and, people on all stripes to really know what is actually occurring on the landscape and thus what might we actually expect to occur in the future. And so we took a really close look at this in the last triennial report, the second triennial report that came out in 2018. And we really came to understand better that these different data sets, they're all faithful, they're all good to their own definitions of what land use change is. They just define it differently. And so total cropland, when you're talking about the USDA Ag Census, is really a compilation of 5 different land classes, some of which is not agriculture or not currently used for agriculture, like row crops. And then other data sets like the National Resources Inventory defines cropland very differently. And so once it's the dirty work of analysis. Like once you look under the hood and you actually disentangle what the different terminology and language is, a lot of these data sets are now saying the same thing, that there is some land use change occurring, but it's actually, it's relatively small depending on what you define small to be. These estimates come up to be around between 4 and 5 million acres converted over a 4 or 5 year period. And, that's between 1 and 2% of the current agricultural footprint. But 1-2% of a big footprint is still, approximately the size of the state of New Jersey. So whether that's big or small depends on your reference point. So I think that has helped us at least to really communicate that the truth is somewhere in between these extremes that you hear about in both the public media and in terms of the peer-reviewed literature.
Okay, thank you, Chris. One challenge of the Bioeconomy Initiative is to increase knowledge, data, and tools to understand the impacts of the bioeconomy. Can you speak to your efforts to understand the impacts of the economy? Maybe Chris, if you want to start first, and we'll go down the line.
Sure. You were breaking up a little bit. This is about the tools?
Yes.
Yeah. So I think that, when a lot of what we are doing is developing these sort of, research efforts to understand the effects of the bioeconomy, biofuels, biomass. And ultimately, some of those are dynamic models that we try to make available to the public so that they can then either better understand them, or they can be used in these sort of financial enterprises to estimate future effects. So I think it's all part of this knowledge sharing that BITO has been supporting to try to make as many of these tools and data sets publicly available as we possibly can.
Okay, Jordan?
I think it's a great question. I mean, when we talk about how increasing knowledge and tools can be pivotal to the success of the bioeconomy, I want to give a clear example about how a relatively small investment in the project by BITO, in the project that we've been driving together with Idaho National Labs to develop a standardized approach for capital markets to understand feedstock risk, can really make a big difference in to bio-based development in local communities, and to really investment in the bioeconomy as a whole. So once you enable increased knowledge, in this case, knowledge of feedstock risks for capital markets, and once you give them the tools to understand it and score it, which are the ratings that have been developed in this project, then you enable all sorts of things to happen. And I'll give an example, and I'll come back to the Federal Opportunity Zone program that I mentioned at the beginning, because doing what we've done here gives the ability to leverage the multi-billion-dollar Federal Opportunity Zone program to support and really supercharge bio-based development in Federal Opportunity Zones across the country. And here's why. There are 9,000 Federal Opportunity Zones across the country. Not all of them are right for bio-based development, but by our estimates, almost 1,500 of them are, meaning they have three factors. They have low feedstock risk, they have a surplus of biomass, and they have good solid infrastructure to support an operating plant. And we can use the standards for biomass supply chain risk, the knowledge and the tools that have been developed in this program to designate the subset of the 9,000 Federal Opportunity Zone areas that are biomass rich and present low feedstock risk. And what that does is it leverages up the ability of local, state, and federal economic development organizations to promote these designations and start to drive bio-based development to this subset of opportunity zones. We call them Bioeconomy Development Opportunity Zones. It's a new program. But just very quickly to wrap up, just to the point of what knowledge and tools starts to enable, well, it enabled the formation of a $65 billion capital markets group that I mentioned earlier. It's enabling, as we speak, the development of something that's called right now the BD Ozone Investment Coalition, which is formed from those 65 capital market members, and which we anticipate in the next month will make a joint announcement to invest $1 billion in projects located in opportunity zones that present low feedstock risk as certified and designated using the biomass supply chain risk standards. So there you go. It's a direct line from increasing knowledge and tools to levering up existing programs to harnessing capital markets to driving investment into areas where it may never otherwise go.
Okay, well, thank you, Jordan. We're coming close to the end. I want to just maybe short circuit my questions and take a couple of quick questions from the audience. And again, try to keep your answers short. But there's the first question, as several speakers have discussed the possibility of evaluating ecosystem services. I'm curious to know if any of the panelists are familiar with the newly formed Ecosystem Services Market Consortium, and if so, has any efforts been made to reach out to them? Anybody hear of that consortium? Okay.
So I've heard of it, but not really engaged with them. I think it'd be a good opportunity.
Okay, great. Another one real quick for you, Jordan. Can the standards developed by Jordan's efforts also be used by crop insurance agencies like USDA Risk Management Agency?
The first thing I would say is thank you, but let's not give credit. They're not only certainly my company's efforts. I would give real credit to Idaho National Lab and more recently to Los Alamos National Labs that have been involved, as well as a massive industry stakeholder group. However, with that being said, to answer the question, they can indeed be applied to the Farm Credit Program. They speak to feedstock risk, and we think it would be very, very useful in that regard. I would say that since they help investors better understand feedstock risk, we believe they should also be incorporated into the USDA Loan Guarantee Program and the USDA Loan Guarantee Program as a state-of-the-art system to help de-risk government investment into these kind of projects.
Okay. Well, thank you. I think I'll conclude this panel for now. I wish to thank all the panelists for their insights and to the audience for their attendance and questions. I would now like to welcome my colleague from the EPA and co-chair of the Sustainable Bioeconomy Interagency Working Group, Brian Henninger. Brian will begin moderating the Metrics and Indicators panel momentarily. Thank you again.